Let me tell you about the day Elspeth MacLeod paid a man with a heavy winch $50 to haul 20 years of rust and ruin out of a drainage ditch. It was the third Tuesday of a particularly wet April, the kind of day where the sky is the color of a dirty dishcloth and the air smells of turned earth and damp stone. The thing she pulled from the muck and tangled briars was, at one time, a tractor. A Clydesdale 770, a model so old that most folks under 50 had never seen one run. Now, it looked more like a suggestion of a tractor, a skeletal memory of a machine left to the slow digestion of the valley. The engine was a solid block of corrosion. The tires were long since rotted away to leprous flaps of rubber on seized rims, and a small, stubborn poplar tree had grown up straight through the rusting triangle of the drawbar hitch. The laughter started that very afternoon, a low and knowing kind of chuckle that passed from farm to farm, carried on the party lines and over the counter at the general store. It was a gentle mockery, for no one in Glen Caelic truly disliked Elspeth, but it was mockery all the same. They said she'd finally lost her senses, that the grief for her husband Callum, gone 5 years now, had curdled into eccentricity. Dragging home a wreck that even the scrapyard would hesitate to take, it was a sad, foolish thing. That laughter, in its various forms, would echo around the valley for a long, long time. It took 22 years, to be precise, for it to finally fall silent. The artifact of the conflict, as it lay there on a set of heavy wooden blocks behind her barn, was not a pretty sight. It was less a machine and more a geological feature. The original paint, a cheerful shade of agricultural red, had long since surrendered to a deep, flaky patina of orange and brown rust. Moss grew in the shaded crevices of the engine block, and the seat was just a pan of rusted metal filled with rainwater and dead leaves. To any sensible person, it was junk, a lost cause, a settled matter long ago decided by time and neglect. Its value was negative. It would cost more to haul it away for scrap than the weight of the metal was worth. But Elspeth didn't see junk. She saw a set of bones. She saw the ghost of a design so simple, so brutally honest, that it couldn't be truly killed, only put to sleep. She walked around it that first evening, her hands in the pockets of her worn canvas jacket, her boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. She wasn't looking at the rust or the rot. She was looking at the lines of it, the pure mechanical logic. There were no wires to speak of, save for the thick, simple cables for the starter and the generator. There was no computer, no circuit board, no sensor that could be fried by a stray bit of lightning or a splash of water in the wrong place. It was a machine of steel and iron, of gears and levers and controlled explosions. It was a thing a person could understand, if they were willing to listen. To understand why Elspeth MacLeod would spend $50 on a piece of scrap metal, you have to understand where she came from. She was not born a mechanic, but she had married one. Callum MacLeod had been a man whose hands seemed to possess a native intelligence. They were large, scarred, and often stained with grease, but they moved with a quiet certainty, whether he was calibrating a fuel injector or steadying a newborn lamb. He believed that a person didn't truly own a thing until they understood how to fix it. "A machine is a conversation," he used to say, his voice a low burr like stones rolling in a river. "You listen to it, it tells you what it needs. Most people nowadays, they don't listen. They just shout at it, and when it doesn't answer, they throw it away and buy a new one." He had taught her this language, not in formal lessons, but through decades of osmosis, of her holding the light while he worked, of passing him wrenches, of listening to his muttered diagnoses as he traced a problem from a symptom back to its source. He never bought a new machine if an old one could be mended, and his tools, many of which had belonged to his own father, were kept cleaned and ordered with the reverence of a priest tending to sacred relics. Elspeth had inherited this worldview. It was in her bones, a legacy more tangible than any piece of property or sum of money. After Callum passed, she had kept the farm running, not by hiring help she couldn't afford, but by applying his lessons. She learned the rhythms of her own small herd of cattle, the specific needs of the soil in the north pasture, and the unique complaints of the old baler. She was methodical, patient, and deeply principled. Her work was not a means to an end, not a way to generate profit, but a practice, a way of being in the world that honored the lessons of her husband and the quiet integrity of the land itself. She was a woman in her late 50s when she brought the Clydesdale home, her hair streaked with gray and her face lined with the fine map of a life lived outdoors. She was not a sentimental woman, but she felt a profound responsibility to keep things, not just to possess them, but to keep them in the truest sense, to keep them whole, to keep them working, to keep them from the slow, ignominious death of being forgotten. This rusted tractor to her was not an object of nostalgia. It was a test of this principle. It was a promise she was making to a ghost. A year after the Clydesdale was hauled from the ditch, the world came to Glenculloch in the form of a man named Mr. Davies. He arrived in a shiny black sedan that looked utterly alien, parked next to the dusty pickup trucks at the town hall. He was a regional manager for Agrimech Global, a vast corporation that had been swallowing up smaller farm equipment companies for the better part of a decade. He was young, with a sharp suit that had never seen a day of actual farm work, and a smile that was wide but didn't involve his eyes. He carried a leather briefcase and a tablet computer, and he spoke in a language of efficiency and synergy and asset liability management. He had come to sell the valley on the future. He was polite, professional, and utterly dismissive of the way things had always been done. The future, he explained in a slick presentation filled with charts and graphs, was a lease-to-own program for their new line of tractors, the Agrimech 9000 series. These were not mere tractors. They were integrated agricultural platforms. They drove themselves with GPS, monitored soil moisture with sophisticated sensors, and could be diagnosed and even updated remotely from a corporate office 500 miles away. They promised higher yields, lower fuel consumption, and more time for the farmer to manage their business, which seemed to be the whole point. The initial conflict came when Davies, making his rounds to visit the local farms and press his case, came up Elspeth's long gravel drive. He saw the Clydesdale 770 sitting behind the barn. By this point, Elspeth had managed to get it mostly disassembled. The great heavy pieces were laid out on tarps in a semblance of order. The engine block on a stand, the transmission housing open to the air, the wheels off, the chassis stripped bare. She was meticulously cleaning a half-century of grime from a set of planetary gears with a small brush and a can of diesel fuel. Davies stopped, a look of amused pity on his face. "Doing a little restoration project, are we?" he asked, his tone that of an adult speaking to a child with a particularly hopeless hobby. Elspeth looked up, her hands black with grease, and simply nodded. "It's a Clydesdale 770, she said, her voice quiet and factual. Davies chuckled. "I know. My grandfather had one, a real beast. But you know, they're museum pieces now. The fuel consumption alone would bankrupt you, and good luck finding parts. Our new 9000 series is 30% more fuel efficient, and with our comprehensive service plan, you never have to worry about parts or repairs. We handle everything." Elspeth wiped her hands on a rag and stood up, her back straight. "What happens when the satellite signal goes out?" she asked. Davies' smile faltered for a fraction of a second. We have redundant systems. It's extremely reliable. And when a circuit board fails in the middle of planting, and your nearest technician is 100 miles away, she continued, her gaze steady. Our service response times are the best in the industry, he said, recovering his polished tone. We can have a unit swapped out within 48 hours in most cases. Elspeth looked from the polished young man to the disassembled heart of the old machine. 48 hours to a farmer with a crop in the ground and a weather front moving in might as well be a lifetime. She didn't say this. She just looked at him. Davies took her silence as a quaint, stubborn refusal to see the logic of his position. He made his final assessment, a judgment that was both professional and deeply flawed. Ma'am, he said, his voice softening into a condescending sort of kindness. I admire your sentimentality. I really do. It's charming. But this is a business. You can't run a modern farm with a relic. It's just not economically viable. Let us worry about the machines. You worry about the farming. He handed her a glossy brochure, gave the rusting parts a final, dismissive glance, and walked back to his clean car. He had made a formal, professional assessment. He had dismissed her perspective as amateurish and her project as a fool's errand. And in doing so, he had completely failed to understand what he was looking at. He saw a pile of junk. Elspeth saw the only thing that could be truly relied upon. And so began the quiet work. It was a process that unfolded not in days or weeks, but over the slow, unhurried calendar of the seasons for 22 years. The first 2 years were dedicated almost entirely to cleaning. Every single bolt, nut, and washer was removed, soaked in solvent, scrubbed with wire brushes until the original maker's marks were visible, and then coated in a thin film of oil and laid out in labeled trays. She used dental picks and stiff bristled brushes to clear out the coolant passages in the engine block, which were choked with a solid mass of rust and mineral deposits. She scraped away layers of old, hardened gasket material with a patience that bordered on meditative. Her son Liam, a teenager then, would sometimes come out to the barn and watch her. "Why, Mum?" he'd ask. "You could buy a running tractor for what you're spending on grease and cleaning fluid." And Elspeth would just shake her head slightly and say, "You can't know what's broken until you know what's clean." Callum always started with clean. The most important part of this process was not the physical labor, but the documentation. This was the analog record. Callum had left behind a small shelf of composition notebooks, the kind with the mottled black and white covers. They were filled with his neat, blocky handwriting. In these books was the entire history of every machine he had ever owned. There were oil change dates, part numbers, and torque specifications. But there was more. There were hand-drawn diagrams sketched from memory, showing how a complex linkage was assembled. There were notes on the specific personality of each machine. Massey Ferguson hesitates on a cold start unless the choke is held for 3 extra seconds. John Deere's hydraulic pump whines when the fluid is low, but also when it's too cold. Check the temperature first. For the Clydesdale 770, which he had bought used and run for a decade before it finally gave up the ghost and was pushed into that ditch, there were 15 pages. He had documented its every quirk: a tendency for the third gear to be sticky, a specific torque sequence for the head bolts that prevented a coolant leak, the exact thickness of a shim needed to properly align the power takeoff shaft. Elspeth took down one of Callum's unused notebooks and began her own record. She did not see this as a separate volume, but as a continuation of his work. Her handwriting was finer, more slanted, but the method was the same. She measured everything. Using a set of calipers and micrometers that had been her husband's, she recorded the diameter of every cylinder bore, the thickness of every gear, the wear on every bearing surface. She noted which parts were salvageable, which needed to be repaired, and which were beyond hope. Her notes were precise and devoid of emotion. Cylinder 3 bore 0.015 inches out of round. Requires reboring and oversized piston. Main bearing journals within tolerance, but show minor scoring. Wheel polish. Transmission input shaft splines heavily worn. Cannot be repaired. Must be replaced. This notebook, and the ones that followed it over the years, became the physical manifestation of her deep, experiential knowledge. It was not data on a screen. It was information earned through touch and measurement, written in graphite and stained with grease. It was the tractor's soul, transcribed onto paper. The passage of time was marked by the slow accumulation of parts. Finding components for a Clydesdale 770 was a scavenger hunt that spanned a continent and 2 decades. She wrote letters, not emails, but actual letters, written in longhand, to old tractor clubs and parts dealers in places like Iowa and Saskatchewan. She spent hours on the phone with old men in dusty warehouses, describing a specific gear or seal, not by a part number, which was long lost, but by its function and dimensions. Sometimes, a package would arrive weeks later containing a part that was grimy and used, but still within the tolerances she had recorded in her notebook. More often than not, the parts were simply unavailable. The company that made the Clydesdale had been bought by another company, which was then bought by Agramec Global, and the old inventory had been scrapped decades ago to make room for new stock. When a part couldn't be found, Elspeth made it. She had Callum's old metal lathe and a small milling machine in the corner of the workshop. She taught herself how to use them, starting with simple things like bushings and spacers, her first attempts clumsy and wrong. But she was patient. She read old machining textbooks from the library. She learned the feel of the cutting tool against the spinning steel, the different sounds the lathe made when it was cutting smoothly versus when it was chattering. Over years, she fabricated a new water pump shaft, a set of custom valve guides, and, in a feat of craftsmanship that took her an entire winter, a perfect replica of the irreplaceable transmission input shaft, machined from a solid billet of hardened steel. Liam grew from a skeptical teenager into a man with a family of his own. He moved to the city for a while, worked in an office, but the valley eventually called him back. He took over the day-to-day running of the farm, leasing one of the new Agramec tractors that were now on almost every property in the Glen. He loved his mother, but he still saw the Clydesdale project as her eccentric obsession, a harmless but pointless way for her to feel close to his father. He'd watch her in the evenings, hunched over the engine block under the single bare bulb of the workshop, her hands steady, her focus absolute. The tractor was slowly, imperceptibly, coming back together. The chassis was painted, a deep, correct red she had custom mixed herself. The engine was reassembled, each bolt torqued to the exact specification written in her notebook. The transmission was rebuilt, the new shaft fitting with a satisfying, snug precision. It was no longer a pile of junk. It was a machine, waiting. The quiet work continued, unseen and unappreciated by everyone except Elspeth herself. She was not in a hurry. The work was not a race. It was a long, slow conversation with the machine and with the memory of the man who had taught her its language. The crisis arrived on the 18th of August, 22 years after the Clydesdale was pulled from the ditch. It came not as a flood or a fire, but as a strange, silent storm. It was a solar flare, a coronal mass ejection, more powerful than anything recorded in over a century. For most of the world, it was a minor inconvenience, a few hours of scrambled radio signals, a beautiful display of the aurora borealis in latitudes that had never seen it before. But for the farmers of Glen Calliach, it was a catastrophe. The massive wave of electromagnetic energy that washed over the earth was precisely what the sophisticated electronics of the Agrimec 9000 series tractors were not designed to handle. It didn't just knock out the GPS, it fried them. Circuit boards were overloaded, delicate sensors were burned out, and the complex software that ran everything crashed in a way that was permanent. One by one across the valley, the tractors simply died. They coasted to a stop in the middle of fields, their colorful touchscreen displays dark, their engines silent. They were no longer tractors. They were $300,000 paperweights. The timing could not have been worse. It was the peak of the harvest. A week of dry, sunny weather had ripened the barley perfectly, and another 2 days were forecast before a massive front of rain was predicted to sweep in from the Atlantic. If the crop wasn't brought in before that rain, it would be ruined, beaten into the mud. An entire year's income for the dozen farms in the glen would be lost. Panic set in. The farmers called the Agrimec Emergency Service Line. The response was polite, corporate, and utterly useless. A recorded message informed them that the company was experiencing unprecedented network-wide issues, and that service requests would be handled in the order they were received. A harried-sounding representative eventually called back and informed the head of the local farmers co-op that the required motherboards were on back order, and the earliest they could schedule a team of technicians to come out and begin the weeks-long process of repairing the fleet was, optimistically, mid-October. The established system, the one that promised efficiency and reliability, had offered a response that was effectively a death sentence for the harvest. The future Mr. Davies had sold them had failed, completely and utterly. That evening, a grim silence fell over the valley. The fields were golden and ready, but the machines that were supposed to harvest them stood inert and useless. Liam came into his mother's kitchen, his face drawn and pale with worry. "It's over," he said, slumping into a chair at the old wooden table. "Everything's gone. The bank owns that tractor, and in a week, the crop will be worthless. We're ruined. Everyone is." Elspeth was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. She didn't turn around. She just listened, as she always did. She had heard the news on the radio, had seen the dead machines sitting in her neighbor's fields. She had been out in her workshop all afternoon, making the final adjustments. She had filled the Clydesdale's fuel tank from a drum of diesel, checked the oil, and bled the fuel lines. She had connected a fresh, heavy battery to the simple, thick cables. She had done everything the notebooks, both Callum's and her own, told her to do. After Liam finished speaking, she turned off the stove, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at her son. "Finish your soup," she said, her voice calm and even. "Then come and give me a hand. I think it's ready." Liam followed her out to the workshop, his mind too numb with despair to even question her. The Clydesdale 770 sat just outside the open barn doors, gleaming under the security light. The red paint was deep and glossy, the tires were new and black, and the simple glass of the gauges was clean. It looked like it had just rolled off a factory floor in 1968. It looked impossible. Elspeth climbed up into the iron seat, her movements slow but sure. She pulled a small lever on the dashboard, a fuel cutoff that Callum had noted was the secret to a clean start. She pushed the throttle forward a quarter of the way. She looked at Liam, who stood watching, his face a mask of disbelief. Then, she turned the key. There was a low groan from the heavy starter motor, a sound of immense rotational inertia being overcome. The engine turned over once, twice, a heavy rhythmic chug, chug, chug. On the third rotation, a cloud of black smoke coughed from the vertical exhaust pipe, and the engine caught. It wasn't a roar like a modern diesel. It was a deep, thudding, percussive sound, a series of controlled, powerful explosions contained within a fortress of cast iron. It was the sound of pure, uncomplicated mechanical power. A sound that hadn't been heard in that valley for a generation. The sound echoed off the hills in the quiet evening air, a heartbeat returning to a landscape that had fallen silent. Elspeth let the engine warm up, her hand resting lightly on the gear shift, her eyes on the oil pressure gauge. She could feel the vibration of the machine through the soles of her boots, a living thing waking from a long sleep. It was not a conversation anymore. The machine was singing. Liam just stared, his mouth slightly open. He was looking at the impossible, made real. He was looking at 22 years of his mother's stubborn, quiet, methodical work, now alive and breathing smoke in the cool night air. Elspeth engaged the clutch, the gears meshing with a solid, satisfying clunk, and drove the Clydesdale out of the yard and into the waiting field of barley. She switched on the lights, two simple, round beams that cut through the twilight, and lowered the old combine harvester she had also maintained over the years. And she began to work. The sound of the old tractor, steady and relentless, carried across the entire valley. One by one, lights came on in the other farmhouses as people came out onto their porches to listen, to try and understand the source of that rhythmic, powerful sound. It was the sound of hope. The next morning, as the sun rose, Elspeth was still at it. Her neighbor, old Mr. Henderson, was the first to arrive. He stood at the edge of the field, his hat in his hands, and just watched. After a while, he walked up to the slow-moving tractor. "Elspeth!" he shouted over the engine's noise. We all thought..." He didn't know how to finish. Elspeth throttled the engine down and looked at him. "It's just a machine," she said. "It does what it's told." By midday, a small crowd had gathered. Farmers, their faces etched with worry and now a dawning sense of wonder, watched as the old red tractor worked its way back and forth across the field, never hesitating, never stopping. Liam, his despair replaced with a profound, humbling awe, was running a grain wagon back and forth, unloading the combine's hopper. He felt like he was seeing his mother for the first time. He was seeing the quiet strength he had always mistaken for mere eccentricity. He saw the wisdom in her patience, the sheer, undeniable power of her deep, hard-won knowledge. The reveal was not a single moment, but a slow, dawning realization that spread through the community. The true value of Elspeth's work was not in the tractor itself, but in the knowledge that had brought it back to life. Another farmer remembered he had an old, forgotten tractor of a similar vintage sitting in a back shed. It hadn't run in 30 years. A small delegation went to Elspeth. Could you look at it?" they asked, their voices full of a new respect. Elspeth stopped her work, took out her grease-stained notebook and flipped through the pages. She asked them a few precise questions about the engine's model and its symptoms the last time it ran. Then she pointed to a diagram she had drawn years ago. "The fuel pump on that model has a diaphragm that dries out," she said. "You can make a new one from a piece of reinforced rubber, and check the points on the distributor. The gap should be no more than 15 thousandths of an inch." She told them exactly what to look for, what to listen for. She was giving them not just instructions, but a piece of her understanding. Armed with this knowledge, a small group of farmers, who had come to rely on technicians and computers, managed to bring the second old tractor back to life by evening. The sound of its engine joining the Clydesdales was a chorus of defiance against the silent, dead technology that littered their fields. 2 days later, the valley was a hive of activity. Elspeth's Clydesdale ran for 72 hours straight, stopping only for fuel and for Elspeth to hand over the controls to a neighbor so she could rest for a few hours. The two resurrected tractors worked alongside it. They were slow, they were loud, but they were unstoppable. They brought in Elspeth's crop, then Henderson's. Then they moved on to the next farm, and the next. The work was communal, the way it had been when Elspeth was a girl, with people sharing the labor, the food, the worry, and now the growing sense of triumph. On the third day, just as they were finishing the last field, a shiny black sedan, a newer model than the last one, pulled up at the end of the lane. A man got out. It wasn't Mr. Davies, but a younger man, his face pale